Welcome to Two Homes. This podcast explores the relationship between our inner world and the systems we live within, from our bodies and beliefs to the businesses, destinations, and environments we shape. Because sustainability that isn't embodied doesn't last, and well-being that stays at the surface level doesn't change much at all. Together, we'll explore what it really takes to build systems that support people, places, and the planet over the long term. From leadership and organisational culture to the hidden patterns that shape how we live, work, and travel. This is an invitation to look a little deeper and to discover how meaningful change often starts closer to home than we think. Hello and welcome to Two Homes. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about emissions, in particular Scope 3 emissions, though we'll touch on all of them. A couple of episodes in the works that are a little bit more detailed, a little bit more on the reporting and some of those things that are maybe a little less exciting to talk about, but nonetheless are really important. And I'm going to do my best to make them as interesting as possible. If you're in Australia, you've probably already heard about, hopefully, the ASRS reporting and new mandatory climate disclosure obligations. And if you're listening from Southeast Asia, this isn't just about Australia. Singapore has similar mandatory reporting for listed companies right now. Malaysia has followed. Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines are all moving in that direction as well. And whether you're operating in Australia or Southeast Asia, if any of your suppliers, investors, or corporate travel buyers are in scope for these requirements, they're going to be asking for your data on that as well. So this isn't a matter about whether it's directly relevant to you or not, because it probably already is. So the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards were introduced back in 2024 and took effect from January 2025 and has an onboarding process that has Scope 1 and 2 emissions mandatory from year 1 and Scope 3 required from the second reporting year. Further, there's 3 reporting groups, and they're structured around revenue, assets, and employee thresholds. So Group 1 already underway. Group 2 are coming online now, so July 2026, and Group 3 are coming online next year in July 2027. Whether you're in one of those groups or not, you may well be dealing with one of those groups. So as I said when we first opened, it's not just about whether you're directly required to report. You're going to have someone knocking on your door and asking for a lot of those details, if not now, extremely soon. From what I've seen working throughout Southeast Asia and Australia is that many of the initiatives that Australia are making, ASEAN economies are close behind, or actually in many cases going first, and Australia may on occasion be behind. It also comes up in conversations, not just around supply chain, but also around banking, investment, and portfolio management. So there is increasingly a need for this information, and it also shows up in certification. I've already worked with several Asian companies that are needing to figure this out in terms of their certification processes, auditing, and maintenance. So while we're on these topics, these are jobs that often are passed off to the accountant or the engineers. And in today's episode, I'm going to do my best to explain these in practical terms as best as I know, because as the daughter of an accountant and the sister of an engineer, I had no idea what they were talking about most of the time. But seriously, over my career, I find that it's extremely satisfying taking complex ideas and breaking them down, mainly so I know what they mean for myself. And, here we are. We're going to figure this out and go on the journey together. We're also going to look at what the human and operational story inside the emissions data looks like. So let's start with basics, scope 1, 2, and 3. So just for context, scope 1, these are the direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So this is gas boilers, company vehicles, generators, anything that is directly owned by the company on site. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity, heating and cooling. And then scope 3 is everything else. So everything upstream that you purchase and everything downstream in the value chain. So for most hotels, scope 3 is one of the largest total emissions footprints, and it's often 70 to 90%. So in previous episodes, we've talked about that scope 2 factor, the electricity, heating and cooling. And that's already a big footprint. But scope 3 is generally even bigger. Let's dive into scope 3 a little bit more. Purchase goods and services and everything that you buy to run a hotel. This is the food, the beverages, amenities, cleaning products, linen, uniforms. Every single product has embedded emissions from how it's grown, how it's manufactured, packaged, and transported to your door. So when I was thinking about how we can really how I can really get my head around scope 3 emissions, I started to think of the great Zen Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talks about the cloud in your teacup. I really love this reference because once you start to make sense of it, it is scope 3. So I often pause before my morning coffee or cup of tea, and I think about giving thanks to the rain and the sunshine and the soil that were required to grow those tea leaves or those coffee beans, to the farmers who were involved in the process of nurturing those plants and harvesting the beans or the leaves, to the insects and the nutrients that helped to create my cup of coffee. That's what the cloud in the teacup or the coffee cup is. The cloud is how it rains, and the rain is how coffee and tea grow. Everything that goes into the goods that we use, from the coffee to the linen to the cleaning products. There is this huge ecosystem of conditions, of resources that are required to bring it to life. It's why organic is such a hot topic. It's why locally grown produce is a win. The emissions are lower, there's less chemicals, there's less transport, and the product is more often than not superior and fresher. It's why when we reduce the amount of amenities being used on a day-to-day basis, that it makes a difference. And these might seem like small things, but they compound over time. So it's why smart menus that offer a balanced, vegetable-leaning, local approach have a lower footprint. Food sourcing, in particular animal products, typically carry the highest embedded emissions of any procurement category. Beef production generates roughly 60 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of protein, compared to around 3.5 kilograms for chicken and under 1 kilogram for most legumes and beans. These are the kind of conversations and the kind of things I was looking at when I went through my phase of being vegetarian and veganish. And for me, those reasons were really around the environmental impact. Because these emissions, if we're talking about beef, the cloud in our teacup, the devastation in our beef production is deforestation. It is the huge amounts of grain that are produced simply for the purpose of feeding cows for humans to eat. It's all of these things that are really hard to see from the surface. It's the devastation to our ocean floors and environment, the biodiversity, the bycatch, as it's called in the fishing industry, where the incredible amount of other marine life is killed in order to catch fish for humans to eat. These are the things we don't see, we most often don't want to look at because they're pretty awful, and because our consumption has become so huge and often wasteful that these industries are trying to find quicker, faster ways to fish, to produce beef really fast. And there's a huge cost that comes along with it. And as well as that cost, we're now seeing reporting mandates, which are great, to be able to have some visibility over that, because what we can't see, we can't measure, and what we can't measure, we can't change. So when I look at sustainability with a hotel, the conversation isn't just one thing or another. And I think this is really important because it's often where external arguments and blaming and not enoughing comes in, where we see examples of a company doing one thing, but then they're called out for not doing something else. When we take a holistic approach, we look at where all of the emissions are coming from. So it's not just the energy use, it's also the food, it's also the locality. There are so many opportunities to adjust menus, the composition, the sourcing, and so many other things without compromising on the quality or the perceived luxury or service that is expected from guests when they stay in a hotel. The linen and textile supply chains, the construction, the fit-out materials, these are also really high-impact categories that rarely get examined. And waste, what's happening to what leaves the property, landfill, composting, recycling, each has a different emissions profile, and landfill is the most costly. So whilst in recent years we've seen a huge push to divert from landfill, that's one thing, that's one step of the journey. There's a much bigger opportunity to reduce overall waste at the source and reduce the emissions at the same time. Business travel and employee commuting are another factor to consider. This is the downstream part of Scope 3. How does your team get to work? How does your leadership team travel, your biz dev team? These are often overlooked, but they're extremely measurable and becoming more measurable. In fact, like corporate travel agents will often measure these emissions for you and give you a summary on your monthly reports. It's also why active transport is such a present conversation, and clients that I've worked with in the past have wanted to get the team on board with more public transport, more walking to work, less private vehicle use. This is Scope 3 in action. Guest travel, the emissions from guests travelling to reach your property, you don't control this, but in some frameworks you're asked to account for it. And it definitely shapes decisions about where you position your sustainability story. A few years back, I did an emissions calculation for a 3-day conference. And it was really wild to see that most of the emissions for the conference came from the delegates that were visiting. And it was a pretty fun and complex task, measuring people coming from all different places to come to this one conference. It's also shaped my personal decisions about business travel and adding extra time on. And I think there's also an opportunity to use that in the hotel sector if we're having a conversation about guests that are staying, and the longer the stay in one location, the more that intensity of emissions is evened out. So for myself, if I've got to travel for a conference overseas in particular, I'll add extra days to give myself a moment to recharge, explore, experience some enjoyment, as well as being there for work, nurturing my inner well-being, and at the same time, leveling out the intensity of the emissions required for me to get there. Spending more money locally. This is, for me, a really important part of my business policy on business travel. So a really simple way to start looking at this is to map out what you actually buy. Before you try measuring anything, a purchasing audit gives you a category map that you need to start estimating the embedded emissions. You don't need to measure everything to the dot on year one, but you do need to know what your biggest categories are so you can start there. This is where working with the team, working all together, makes this job a bit lighter to lift. It can even make it fun. So questions like whether there's a local option or an independent brand or small or medium business that could provide the product or service that meets your needs. In very simple terms, when I was working with small businesses in Sydney, this conversation would sometimes look like, where are you buying your office supplies from? Can you buy them locally? If you're buying computer equipment off Amazon, Is there perhaps a local computer shop that you could go and buy from instead? This needs to make sense, but it's also important to look just beyond like what is the perceptively the cheapest. There needs to be a layer of considerations in here. Certification standards like GSTC, that's the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, they break this down really well. They define what aligns with these parameters as well as ensuring it's fit for purpose. It's not one thing or another. It's not it's sustainable or it's not sustainable. It's sustainable but it's not fit for purpose. It's fit for purpose but it's not sustainable. They both can exist, and you can find the right balance of what is going to work for you. So often we get caught in a trap of focusing on revenue alone, and that focus can often be costing operators a lot more money than it seems. There's a cost embedded in every cheap supplier relationship. This is what's going to come to surface. So buying that cheap thing off Amazon when there's a slightly more, probably better quality opportunity right on your doorstep at the local computer shop is going to affect your emissions calculation. Many of these online retailers, you might buy something, you get that one item is shipped to you directly. They're often coming from multiple locations, and so one thing goes to you from one place, another thing goes to you from another place. So somewhere that's a bit more of an aggregate in store, you're reducing your emissions because everything is already there in the one place. So when it comes to purchasing, where can you aggregate more? Where can you get more things with a shorter supply chain from fewer places rather than small orders coming one by one from great distance? I know it's not as cut and dry as that. It's not as simple as that, but I often think of these things. Like if I can go to a store and get multiple things from the one location, this is more resourceful for my time and energy as well as for that sourcing and those scope 3 emissions that are coming from individual shipping. So I'd encourage you to think about, what are those efficiencies? So fit for purpose, efficiency, and not needing to necessarily go granular down to everything having to come from a different location to be the best, but finding a happy medium where you can get most things from this place or many things from that place and start to build an ecosystem in your supply chain that supports that reduces emissions, fulfills fit for purpose, and ideally has some sustainability and environmental aspects, human rights aspects, etc. built in as well. One of the biggest challenges that we have in sustainability is looking beyond that face value. So there's going to be more on that in future episodes, but for today it's like looking at, what are you purchasing? Back to the point that I was making at the beginning, doing a purchasing audit, looking at what the categories, what are you buying? Do you perhaps even need all of the things you're buying, or have they just been on autopilot, repeat time and time again? So I worked with a client on mapping their supply chain, and it sparked some really exciting and thoughtful conversations. Among the responsible and environmentally conscious aspects, the other key areas focused on that fit for purpose, risk mitigation, fairness and transparency, local sourcing, local production, and value for money. When you figure out what your main values are, what your criteria are, then you can start balancing out the cost and the emissions in a meaningful way. So what might be the best overall value may be a slightly more expensive product, but it's local. And so in the long run, it's better than a high emissions product that's imported and that you will be reporting on and paying for in terms of emissions later down the track. What I've especially appreciated through this work is how resourceful and creative a lot of the Asian properties I've worked with are. Some supplies aren't able to be procured locally in remote areas, so there's a balance. But the default is often that it's locally made with just a few rare exceptions. And this goes beyond just emissions as well, because it's these kind of localized, unique, thoughtful aspects that create a stronger connection with the guest. So these considerations count beyond just cost and emissions, they also are part of the brand. They're part of what keeps guests returning. And I see this just so much more across the places I've worked with in Southeast Asia, a willingness to be resourceful, to use the local supplier rather than getting just the stock standard off-the-shelf everyday item that's mass-produced. So with that picture of what's in your Scope 3 footprint, let's talk about what most operators actually do with this information and where the opportunity gets missed. I see 3 opportunities that are available to us. When a hospitality operator decides that they need to do something about emissions reporting, what tends to happen is the job is handed off to an existing staff member, someone who's already got a full-time role, and that person is perhaps responsible for all of the reporting, or perhaps alongside an accounting firm to run the calculations. So this can produce a compliance report. The numbers are auditable, the box is ticked, and most companies stop exactly there and feel relieved. We've done the bare minimum, and this is where compliance doesn't save the planet. That report doesn't do anything to change how the business operates. It doesn't do anything about the emissions in the supply chain, and those exact numbers will be there, maybe even higher, the following year. Procurement decisions will still be made in the same way, and staff won't be doing anything different. And in a year or 2 or 3, when assurance requirements tighten, which they are bound to do, and corporate buyers start asking harder questions than what they're currently asking, the gap between what's reported and what's real will start to become glaringly obvious. So there are at least 3 distinct layers to understanding and utilising your emissions report. The calculation and the compliance layer, this there that we've just talked about, measuring emissions, producing an auditable report, meeting the ASRS requirements. This is accounting and data work, and it is extremely valuable because if you're not measuring it, you don't know where you stand. So this is the first layer. Then there's the operational integration layer. So this is understanding what do those numbers mean, translating complex terms into meaningful changes that can be applied on the ground in the day-to-day. This is identifying where the highest impact changes are, engaging procurement and the wider team, and building internal capabilities so that report reflects something real about how the business is operating. And then there's the strategic narrative layer, how a business communicates its sustainability position to investors, corporate buyers, guests, and staff in a way that's credible and not greenwashing. This requires the operational work to be genuine. So that layer number 2 is the most important one, and yet it seems more often than not that layer 1 and layer 3 get more of the focus. That's why there's a disconnect, and that's why we see issues with greenwashing or issues with policies that are not really what's playing out in reality. All 3 of these are important to gain the financial benefits that are available through this. And while the reporting is becoming a requirement and really fast, the opportunity is actually an opportunity. The opportunity is actually in your favor. When we slow down and consider that maybe it's not a punishment, that there is a huge benefit to come from this, then we'll start to see the benefits that are really there. The risk bubbling away under the surface at the moment is to ignore this. It's still early days. We're learning this together. There are bugs that are being figured out as we go. And with every bug, with every bump in the road, there's a tendency to say that it's not working or that it's not effective. There's a tendency to push back and feel like, why are we doing this? But the bumps in the road and the bugs, they're part of the process. And they'll get smoothed out. And as we smooth them out, we learn along the way. So the tendency with regulation, reporting, and even certification is to leave things to the last minute. This is something that I've just seen over and over and over again in pretty much every company I've worked for and with, from businesses renewing certification with the certifying bodies that I've worked for, to companies coming up for their auditing periods, to rushing to get things done. So waiting until reporting is due is where it starts to get risky, because overdue reporting and associated fines are going to be the other side of that. Because waiting until reporting is due is where you start to run the risk of associated fines with overdue reporting. There's also going to be problems with auditing as companies that are organised. There's also going to be problems with auditing because the companies that are organised will have already booked in their time. I saw this quite a few times when I was working at Gecker, that people would get to the end of their certification validity, they'd suddenly want to rush it through, and they wouldn't be able to get an auditor because the auditors were already scheduled out months in advance. This would put them over, this would put them behind, and this would see them paying extra money. So the smart way to do it is to start early. Like a client I was recently speaking with, their mandatory reporting begins in 2027, but they're paving the way by doing voluntary reporting in 2026. That's already building internal capability and reporting infrastructure. And then they're also working on a plan to engage the wider team. So as I've already highlighted, mapping procurement and supply chains help. I've had clients do this in spreadsheets. You can even start by making a mud map on a whiteboard if that process helps you get it all out to begin with. There's also a lot of really great digital data capture tools, or many hotels also have great systems and apps for tracking information. So if we categorize this into 4 main areas, and just to reiterate those, I touched on them briefly, let's touch on them again here. There's purchasing, so looking at all of that purchasing, all of the things that are being bought, from food to pens to uniforms to bed linens. Then there's waste, so what's leaving, the different waste streams, how much. It's quite commonplace now to weigh those different waste categories, but there's also an opportunity to audit what's in the waste. Like if there's consistently a repeated item that's being thrown out, it begs the question of why. Why is this being wasted? What can we do to change the makeup of the waste? Then there's internal and external travel. So internal travel, staff travel to expos, to buyers markets, etc. And then external travel, that is the travel of your guests to get to you. And so supplier engagement is another really great opportunity that gets really good, meaningful momentum when it comes to scope 3. I've been working with my clients for years on what this conversation looks like, in particular in the early days regarding plastic packaging. And so now there is some collective education building. This is a topic that was quite surprising back in the early days. But now I would be surprised if anyone was surprised if they were asked about this in the procurement process, whether for new relationships or existing ones. And honestly, I think that before a supplier conversation can really meaningfully begin, there needs to be an internal conversation around the team and the team's literacy when it comes to sustainability. Otherwise, those conversations with suppliers will fall flat. There'll be issues around defensiveness and discomfort of having the conversation, and then often they'll be brushed aside and business will continue as usual. A really honest way to have a discussion with a key supplier about emissions is just to start talking to them, filling them in, letting them know what your company goals are, and asking them how they can help you meet your objective. It's not about being demanding. It's not about pushing any particular ideas on them. It's about bringing them on the journey and in a timely manner, giving them the opportunity to meet you with the direction that you're going in. So if you're aware that sustainability reporting is something that you're going to need to be doing, or that you've already begun but you feel like it's not as thorough or detailed as it needs to be, or if you're aware it's on the horizon but you haven't had a look at the details, what tends to come up when people start looking at it is realizing that it's not just the emissions. There's the strategy, the governance and the improvement pathways that are also really key aspects. So it pays to look early, get prepared early, face the things that are unclear from the get-go, and start to work out what they mean. Start to discuss it together as a team. Because if it's sitting on your to-do list and it's a job for another day, there's a real potential that it's going to take you by surprise and you'll be left scrambling. If we think back to the cloud in the teacup, it's so hard to see some of these things if we're not measuring them, if we're not talking about them, if they're hidden in documents and reports. So I really encourage you to think about making those invisible aspects more visible, more part of the conversation. And when we bring them to the light, they're less scary, they're less overwhelming, and less bemusing. We have the opportunity to figure it out and ask questions. And this is really, for most companies, quite new territory. So there's no shame in not knowing what to do, but leaving it and not facing it is only going to make it harder. Getting curious, opening up conversations, being creative, exploring local suppliers and connections. There's a genuine sustainability story that is available to each and every business. And really, like, the most impressive businesses that I've seen have embraced their local communities, their local suppliers, and created a story that's not just aesthetically alluring, but it's also really meaningful at the end of the day as well. And when we're in the business of travel and tourism, those are the kind of memories that we want guests to go home with. They're thoughtful, they're specific. They're not just, that same smelling bar of soap that every hotel has. There's more of a story. What I notice about hotels in Asia compared to hotels in Australia is that there's often a lot more variety of products and sourcing that happens in Asia. It's more localized. And I find this really interesting because often at every end of this spectrum, when I talk to Westerners about Southeast Asia, there's this conversation around development and that waste and litter and rubbish in Southeast Asia would be so much better if there was more infrastructure, which I don't agree with. I think that the more important question to ask is why all of this single use? And the same can be said for sourcing. It might look like on the surface that sourcing, wouldn't it be great if you could get everything from a large manufacturer? But actually there's a uniqueness and an opportunity and a beauty in the variable sourcing that takes place across such a wide range of things in Southeast Asia. I use these comparisons not to say one is better than the other. We can only see what we can see. If we're only living in Cambodia, we only know the Cambodian context. If we're only living in Sydney, we only know the Sydney context. I've been fortunate to live in both places, but I also know that a lot of the hoteliers out there are moving from property to property, country to country. And so you also have an opportunity to see this perspective and to share this perspective with your teams because there's a lot of wealth in there. And when we open ourselves up to the curiosity of what is more meaningful, unique, connected to the sense of place, supporting local communities, and at the same time, reduce our emissions, reduce our environmental footprint, and really just make that sustainability story a whole lot more genuine. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Two Homes. There is so much that's changing in this space, and when we go through the process, when we start to have these conversations, they're not necessarily easy to begin with, but we can help each other, we can work through them, we can ask questions, and we can start to figure it out. And when we engage with it and work on it and figure it out of a place of curiosity rather than a place of threat, I think that we can really start to uncover a lot of really fantastic potential that goes beyond just the emissions reporting, but has a really wider impact on our teams, our operations, our bottom line, the communities we're working in, and the planet that we live on. So thank you for being here. And if this episode was useful, please share it with a friend. Please leave me a review or a comment on whatever platform you're listening on, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.